You are listening to Talking Images, the official podcast of icmforum.com.
Welcome back, everyone. Today we are talking about the king of quirky, the hey, isn't that weird kind of cinema, the Duke of Oddness, Quentin Dupieux, the man who made an entire horror film about a murderous car tire. He's the man who got John Jordan possessed by deerskin clothing, turning him into a serial killer. He's the man who had two stoners train a fly in the size of, I guess, about a dog to commit heists. He even jumped on the superhero movie bandwagon with Smoking Causes Coughing, with a superhero team sponsored by a tobacco company that kills monsters and bad guys by shooting cancer rays at them. Yes. That Quentin Dupieux, who's also the electro house artist Mr. Rousseau, by the way. He's worked in the US, today he's mainly in France. He's a huge cult name and almost everything he makes is around 80 minutes or shorter. It's all weird and often just extremely in-your-face meta bizarreness with a kind of B-movie, almost a bit trashy and juvenile sidebar, if you will. You know more or less what you're going to get when you enter a Dupieux film. And he's probably our most prolific surreal filmmaker currently, working with at least one new film out every single year. And in this episode, we'll try to figure out just what makes his films tick. We'll see who's fans, who finds him a tad too slight, if any of us, and just what he does with cinema. We'll also, in the honor of Dupieux, not do this episode in chronological order. We're gonna start with his, well, not his very latest, because that's not really released anywhere yet, but his second latest, Daaaaaalí. And then we'll try to work our way all the way back to his cakey debut Nonfilm, which he himself called unwatchable. So we're throwing all caution to the wind here with no set watch list for my co-host. We'll actually just chat about every film and just pretty much anything Dupieux. And if we end up going in circles or end up in odd places, all the better. So I think this is a very good time to bring in my absolutely fabulous co-hosts, Ben, Matt, and Saul. And rather than doing what we usually do, and think of it almost like an elevator pitch here. So I want to bring you on first, Ben, then I'm going to bring in Matt and finally Saul. And I just would like to hear, like, if you were at a dinner party or just hanging out with friends and Dupieux somehow came up in the conversation, how would you even just begin to explain him and his films?
I don't know what kind of weird dinner party I would find myself in where Dupieux would just randomly come up in conversation, but I would say he's highly surrealistic, very absurdist, hilarious. To your point, a little trashy and juvenile at times. He definitely has a tendency to delve into toilet humor and those kind of things, but all of that's part of the rich tapestry that is his film work, and I enjoy it thoroughly.
And what about you, Matt? Because I remember we talked earlier, you said that surrealism is just one of his codes. Like, how would you explain Dupieux?
So, if I was at a dinner party, which, to be honest, I'm not often at one, and it's just my normal friends rather than people who are deeply interested in films, I'd probably say about Dupieux that his scenarios are essentially random. I feel that within 10 minutes I could come up with a bunch of 5 scenarios and people wouldn't be able to pick out which was the real Dupieux scenario if I put a new script of his in the mix. So I think that a lot of his scenarios just seem incredibly random and he just goes with them. I think people that I would go to dinner parties with also know what the word meta is, so I would say that pretty much all of his films, to a greater or lesser extent, have some deep interest in meta. And finally, I would say that it's not what you'd expect from a French film. the mystique that you get about France when you watch a Marcel Pagnol film or a French New Wave or Cinema du Look. That's not what you're getting here. You're getting French people that wear nicotine patches and sort of pick their noses, right? All the mystique is gone. That's probably how I'd describe him.
Yeah, good pitch. What about you, Sal?
I don't feel like I have a lot to add following on from what Matt and Ben have said. But look, I agree with what Ben has said. There's a lot of surrealism throughout most of his films. And also what Matt said, yeah, there's a very cool meta quality to a lot of it. Also what Matt said about the randomness, for me, that's part of the attraction of Dupieux. I know with some people, they do find it a little bit annoying, but for me, I just love the way he can sort of throw any situation into the mix and carve a creative and interesting film out of it. And for me, he is really one of the most consistent directors working today, if not maybe the most consistent. I can't say that I love any of his films strongly. However, I'd say that pretty much everything he's done from Rubber onwards is good or great. But in terms of how I'd describe him in a dinner party, yeah, look, I'll just be very impressed if anybody had heard of him at all or heard of any of his films at all from the people I know in real life. If anybody told me they'd seen Deerskin or heard of Rubber, I'll just be stunned. For me, that would be my Dupieux film moment.
Fair enough. I mean, he actually did come up in conversation at the dinner party of mine. I think what I was focusing on then was he was came up in the course of weird, bizarre films. Essentially, like what's the weirdest stuff you can watch? What's the oddest, craziest? That I think that there is a niche like outside of general cinephiles, even like, hey, this is like the most random, silliest thing you can watch out there, and people might go for it. I think Rubber, honestly, is probably one of those films that transcend this general film buffery. Like that's such a it's like a super trashy B-movie horror film, but it satirizes it as well, obviously, and it has a lot of really interesting things going on in terms of meta, in terms of people actually watching the murders taking place with us, all that kind of stuff. But I think that when you just start talking about, hey, there's a tyre that's driving out there, exploding people's heads with its mind, and there's all these people following it around and watching this murder. Like you can kind of build that up, and like, hey, here's a weird anecdote. That kind of works. I think you can hook people in with Dupieux in ways you probably struggle a little bit. Not to be fair, the people at that dinner table had 2 or 3 had already watched some Buñuel and stuff like that, so it wasn't as hard a pitch as possible. But that takes me to my next question: how you would distinguish Dupieux from other big surrealists. And I think one of you really hit you, Matt, who said that the mystique is gone. And I think that with a lot of surreal filmmakers, like an era of what people would probably call a degree of pretentiousness. There's a degree of metaphors. There's a degree of looking behind the image, and there is a very hyper stylized coldness or perfection. There's obviously plenty of exceptions. There's plenty of silliness. David Lynch obviously also transcends this as well. But with Dupieux, he really takes it to such a silly, more trashy, more juvenile, more almost hangout style movie that all of that just disappears, and you're left with something that you don't even really need to think about. It's just, wow, this is so weird, this is so crazy. And I think he has just a completely different kind of appeal to the almost all other major, generally talked about surreal directors. What do you guys think?
One word that I wouldn't associate with Dupieux is pretentiousness, which is something that you can very easily throw around at surrealist filmmakers. I mean, I think those early movies, The Age of Gold and, Chien Andalou, are cultural bywords for pretentiousness. And to me, it's sort of tempting to say that Dupieux is part of that sort of strand of film history, but I don't know if he himself would associate himself with some of those films. You just don't think anything that he does could be accused of pretentiousness. And maybe that's what sets him apart, for me at least.
I would agree with that to an extent. I don't think he would consider himself in the same bucket as Buñuel or someone like Salvador Dali. I think he just does what he does because he likes it. He reminds me a lot more of the denizens of Adult Swim on the Cartoon Network. That really hit home for me when I watched Wrong Cops and Eric Warheim was in it. I see a lot of similarities between what Dupieux does and what guys like Tim and Eric do. They have a very similar kind of random meta-surrealist sensibility, but without the pretentiousness.
The point you raise about whether he dissociate himself with Dali, I think, is a really interesting one. Because those films that Dali made with Buñuel are quite early in Dali's history. And when I think about Salvador Dali, I try and sort of split him into two eras. And actually, I'm more interested in the sort of 1940s Dali than Dupieux is. There's this idea that after he'd come back from America and had been working with Disney, that he essentially became a provocateur, became very much interested in making money. Whereas there had been a point in his history where, to me, he'd been a really good draftsman. A lot of his work had, a great amount of power. One of the first paintings I ever saw that got me interested in painting, The Face of War, it just has a huge power. For anyone that doesn't know what that one is, it's a picture of a skull, and each sort of hole in the skull has another skull inside, and they just sort of go backwards into infinity. But I think maybe Dupieux sees this early Dali as someone that he's not particularly interested in, whereas the later Dali, who has become just this sort of inscrutable provocateur, maybe that's someone that Dupieux is much more interested in, and maybe the reason he's making that movie is to sort of tilt his hat. I don't know.
That's very possible, yeah, Matt. And thank you for also just bridging us straight into Dali. Dupieux's second to latest film, which we'll talk about next. But before we just dive straight into it, I think I also let Saul answer the question of how he would distinguish Dupieux from other real directors.
Again, I don't feel like I've got much to add beyond what my co-hosts have said already. But I guess with Dupieux, for me, it's more about him being surreal for the fun of it and deriving comedy out of the surreal touches. So for me, he is less like Buñuel. He's less like David Lynch. He's less like Alain Resnais. For me, he's more like Terry Gilliam or maybe Young Spunkmeyer, just in terms of having these really strange things going on there, and in terms of the films being really funny. I mean, the sense of humor is very different from Terry Gilliam, but just in terms of the surreal touches, for me, it's more there to get a laugh and get the audience laughing along, get invested in the world, rather than somebody like Alain Resnais or Louis Buñuel or even David Lynch. I guess it's about him having a good time rather than him diving deep into the way that our mind works.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Saul. I think that all of this really just brings us back to over and over again, Dali. And I'm saying that way because that's how the name is pronounced over and over and over again in this film. And it's probably its most polished. And frankly, I think if you start with Dali, I think that you might not know exactly who Dupieux is just from this film. You mentioned Terry Gilliam, and he said that a lot of the comedy in Dali is actually from Monty Python, or like he feels like he was inspired by some of Monty Python's sticks, etc. from it. So there's definitely that tie-in, but this film does play a little bit more with the Dali persona, and he cast 5 different actors as Dali. They kind of mix them in where they're used. Again, some pretty big stars, including Gilles Lelouch. Some non-Dali actor people here too, like Agnès de Moustier, who's kind of journalist trying to make a movie about him, and Romain Duris as a producer. And it's just kind of this hyper circular, part of it is trapped inside of a dream, and it just spins around and around and around and around, which is very, very, very much Dupieux. But I do think that as a film that's possibly, again, his most polished, it is also dealing with a surreal artist. It almost becomes his most traditional surreal films. And I want to start with you here, Saul, because you said that this is your favorite Dupieux. So what is it that makes Daaaaálí stand out for you?
For me, Daaaaálí is just Dupieux in his element. It's an extremely meta film, and you sort of don't realize it until towards the end just how meta it is. But it's sort of all about Daaaaálí getting videoed and how he feels about getting not videoed. It would be in the old days, or maybe not. There's a little bit of uncertainty as to the exact time period the film is set in, which is kind of one of the most interesting things about it also, because it also plays around with time and how old Daaaaálí is and whether he's actually as old as he thinks that he is. There's no real way to properly explain that without actually seeing the film, but it's sort of really cool how timeless it is. It's sort of like an infinity loop. When I was watching Daaaaálí, Inception came to mind because there are bits and pieces of it where you sort of realize, oh, actually, we're just inside a character's dream, or we're just inside this character talking about his dream. It's not actually what we're seeing. And then it happens even more with the television sets towards the end. So it's just all these layers upon layers upon layers, which to me makes an incredibly complex film. And I guess a bit more complex than some of his other films, which is more about, a jokey idea and taking the jokey idea to a different extreme. This one over here, there's just so many layers within layers within layers. And there's also all these great surreal touches in it. I mean, to me, there couldn't have been a better person to make a biopic about Daaaaálí, because a Daaaaálí biopic shouldn't be a straightforward biopic. Like with the Weird Al Yankovic film, that one wasn't straightforward. This one also isn't straightforward. And there's just an amazing part early on where Daaaaálí is going down this corridor as he's getting ready for the interview. And the woman be interviewing suddenly realizes, oh, I need to go to the bathroom. She goes to the bathroom, comes back, and he's still walking down apparently from the same distance. She has to go in. I think she gets something from the fridge. She comes out again, and again he's walking from the same distance. So it's like he's forever going down that same corridor. And I know it's towards the beginning, but for me, that's just the best possible introduction into the film. And I do wish there were more surreal touches like that, with like the endless, never-ending corridors. But there's just a lot of really cool, interesting parts that are beyond that, from the paintings that Daaaaálí is painting, and you think, what's just a surreal painting, but it's actually the actors or the people who he's painting actually do look like that. I thought that was an incredibly good joke. And just the way everything turns so meta on its head towards the end. Look, at the end of it, I just couldn't help myself. I mean, but before seeing this, I did have Rubber as his best film, but I thought, no, I think this actually classes Rubber as the best film he's done so far.
When I was talking about Daaaaálí as a biopic of Salvador Dali, I think it is a biopic of Salvador Dali, but it's not something that, despite the idea of the movie having timeless quality, I don't think it really delves into any of the way a young Salvador Dali was, or the experiences that he was going through, experiencing the Spanish Civil War, for example, when he's living in Paris. That's not him at all. So I think it is definitely a movie about a very particular time in Dali's life. One of the things that was interesting for me is that I watched it in Rotterdam during the film festival. So it was quite interesting to watch it in a very large cinema, and it was definitely an audience pleaser. Everyone was laughing throughout the entire movie. So there is something in there really about Dupieux, that he's a crowd pleaser. I don't have too much analysis of the film as you guys might, in the sense that for me, trying to get to grips with it and trying to grasp anything was beside the point. As soon as you thought that you were understanding a scene, it would collapse into a different scene, become a dream within a dream within a dream within a dream. Was it real? Is it someone else's thought? Who knows? And that was kind of one of the attractions to me, was that you could just let go of the analytical side of yourself and just watch this succession of absurd images. That's what I got out of it. It's not my favorite of his films, and overall I wouldn't call myself a fan of his, but I thought it was a pretty good movie.
Not my favorite either, but I do think it's one of his most polished. There's so many laughs in there too. I agree fully with so like that the early scene which introduces Daaaaálí as he's walking down that endless corridor, complaining about the endless corridor all along the way. It's quite fun. I think the fact that you have all of these different actors playing Daaaaálí, with all of them doing more or less the same accent, the same pronunciations, and being like the makeup is pretty much done to, with the exception of the older Daaaaálí, to kind of look the same. They're similar but different, and then that's a really fun element of it. I did think that I don't want to spoil too much of it, but I think that that dream within a dream within a dream part of the film ended up taking up too much space for me, and that felt a little bit repetitive after a while. But as a whole, yeah, it was an absolute blast.
Something which I might just point out, which I find interesting, is that I didn't actually realize until after I'd finished watching the film that there was actually 5 different actors playing Daaaaálí. The makeup job, which Chris mentioned, is just so fantastic, and all the actors speak in the same way that it just blew my mind to realize that afterwards, because I was doing my Letterboxd review and I wanted to talk about what a good performance the actor gave, and then I was sort of like stunned. It's like obscure object of desire. I just had like no idea it was 5 different actors playing the one part. It was actually meant to be 6, which is why there's 6 A's in the Daaaaálí title, and it's one of the actors dropped out. But yeah, it's an incredibly great piece of casting.
That's amazing. I mean, I think totally, like, I didn't realize how many actors were actually playing Daaaaálí at first either. I recognized Lelouch, and like I could tell who wasn't Lelouch. I wasn't that familiar with the others. So I was like, okay, there's 3, there's 4. How many are there? But yeah, that was a really interesting part of the film, and that's amazing that you didn't realize. That's just really fun as a tidbit. I think we can go on then from Daaaaálí to a film that's probably one of his. It's actually his very shortest. It's still polished, but it's one of his simplest concepts. Simply has the name of his lead character, Yannick, and it's essentially this guy. He's watching a performance at the theater. There's only a few people there, and he starts to think that, hey, this comedy is boring. And he starts complaining out loud, annoying all of the actors. He stands up, he stops the show, and as they brush him off and he goes to get the refund, he snaps, he gets a gun, and he starts to write his own play and force the actors to play in his superior play, interacting with the audience all along the way. It's just 67 minutes, and then even shorter without the credits. I mean, it's essentially just an hour-long film. He made this just before or while he was making Daaaaálí, which is just why it's such a semi-rushed job. But I thoroughly enjoyed it. Actually, overall, I might actually have preferred it to Daaaaálí. I mean, it's not as polished, not as inventive, but I just had so many laughs throughout the way, and it's just like a really good example of kind of his utter deadpan, absurdist, comedic sensibilities. What did you guys think of Yannick?
I'll actually have a go at starting with this one, if I may. I watched Yannick this week. This was quite a beautiful movie. This is the first of his movies that I've watched that I would call a favourite, and I do think that he's not just a absurdist. There is social commentary in his films as well, and I think he's interested in the concept of what art should be. Should it be entertainment? And that comes out quite a lot in this movie. But I also thought that there was a lot of class commentary there. You know, the character Yannick, he works 7 days a week or 7 nights a week as a night watchman. And part of the reason he's got upset in the movie is that he's had to take a day's holiday in order to come and watch this play. The play is Le Cocu, the cuckold. And in some ways you feel, what was he expecting coming into Paris to watch a play called The Cuckold? Doesn't sound a very promising title, might not cheer one up, might not be worth taking a day off work. But I think what comes out is quite funny, in his rants at the audience. Seemingly everybody else in the audience is from a higher social class. At one point, he refers to them all as bureaucrats. None of them actually do anything anymore. They're the management class who are on Teams and Zooms and send emails, whilst people like him actually physically have to do things. A lot of people who go and watch the theatre could be described as, fairly pretentious, and if we're being mean-spirited, describe them as pretentious. I had a conversation with someone at work recently who told me that actually she was a cinephile for 10 years. She would go, and any time there was a sort of Kurosawa retrospective or what have you, she would turn up. And then she just said, actually, one day I realized that I didn't like any of this stuff at all. And I was just going because I wanted to be sort of seen as someone that was interested in that side of things. And I think Dupieux sort of pierces some of this pretension. The perversion is one of the things that he brings up. Class of people who are very perverted, and he gets a laptop off one of the audience members, and he has a very rude password and pornographic pictures, the wallpaper on his computer. What do a lot of people look like when you take away all this artifice and you actually see who they are? In France, if you think of 1968 and who was going to see plays at that time, people that really wanted society to change, very radical people. Sadly, some people killed themselves after the événement of 1968 because they were so upset that they'd been unable to change the world. What is an audience that goes to see the theatre in Paris like now? Probably quite different. So I think there's a really serious side to the movie, Yannick, and I think there's some pathos. There's this bit where he's got the very hurriedly written play that he's being performed, and there's a tear dropping from his eye because he's so happy that he's seen something that he's thought about being created. So I think it's a very interesting movie. I know, like we sort of joked that how much time can we spend discussing a Dupieux movie because they're not very serious, but I actually thought this one was something that you could almost write a thesis on, that there was so much to talk about.
So I didn't really pick up on the social commentary aspect of Yannick. I did like it quite a bit. It does explore a theme that Dupieux seems to return to again and again about the nature of an audience and this kind of self-reflexive consumption of entertainment. Most of his films have been about that to some extent. And I think it's one of his more straightforward films narratively. I would actually say it might be one of his least absurdist as well, just because the premise itself is absurd, but it plays out beyond the way that the audience reacts, which is really more of a non-reaction. It actually plays out in a way that you would expect that kind of scenario to play out.
Yeah, I mean, this is a film without any otherworldly, utterly bizarre or impossible acts. I mean, the plot of Yannick could technically happen. Like, I think only a few other of his films could theoretically happen, like Wrong Cops. Those are probably the only two that could have happened because everything else has something utterly bizarre happening in them that would be impossible in the real world. And yeah, like you said, Matt, there is actually some degree of real commentary there. I mean, I didn't think about it as thoroughly as you, but I mean, he is overtly, like Yannick, the character, is overtly saying these things in the room. For such a short film that's all about like this strange, bizarre evening, you are right. There is actually a lot more subtext, and this might possibly be the Dupieux film then with the most subtext. All of this could also be why we talked about this as the film came up, that this is his highest rated on IMDb, and I think one of you said it's also the highest rated on Letterboxd. So maybe this would actually be a good place to start for a lot of people as well. Who knows? What do you think about Yannick?
Like Ben, I didn't pick up on all the class issues that Matt pointed out, but they are quite interesting. I did absolutely love the premise of Yannick, the whole idea of getting up, stopping a play midway, and complaining about it not being entertaining. I thought it was a really interesting commentary, but maybe it's not. But I sort of saw it as a bit of a commentary on the way that we are as viewers these days. We're used to watching films at home and streaming them rather than going to the cinema. And at home, you can pause a movie and turn it off and put something else on. It's not really the same as going to the cinema. And of all the Dupieux films that I've seen, only one of them I've actually seen theatrically, which was Deerskin. I think none of the others I've been able to catch in cinemas, and probably Yannick is the one which I would have been most interested to see in cinemas because watching a play, watching a film, it's sort of the same thing. I mean, you can't interact with the film, so we can't interact with. It'd be really cool if you could, but can't interact with the actors within Dupieux's film. But it's the same sort of idea. You're going along to the cinema, you want to be entertained, and then what are you going to do if you're not entertained halfway through? You can't actually go and ask for your money back. Although some cinemas, I think, do let you do that. But anyway, I just thought it was an incredibly interesting situation. I thought it was really well handled. The running time is quite short, and I guess because of that, it does feel a bit slight to me compared to other films. But as I said before earlier on, I consider all of his films to be good or great, and this is definitely one of those.
I've looked into this thing about getting your money back before. I don't think I've ever asked to do it personally. The idea is if you want to get your money back, you need to leave the film sort of relatively early. You sort of wait to the closing credits and then turn up to the front office and say, oh, I didn't really like that movie. They're probably not going to take you very seriously. You have to get out of there.
Yeah, you still consumed the movie in a manner of speaking, right? Whether you liked it or not. It's like if you buy a sandwich and you eat the whole sandwich and then complain that you hated it, oh well, you ate the whole thing. By the way, I agree with Yannick, that play looked terrible.
I remember reading a sort of criticism of literature. I can't remember the name of the book it's in, but the guy makes a joke about literature is filled with so many novels that start, they've got 800 pages and they start with a funeral scene and people are totally okay with turning up in media, sort of getting beaten and abused, and he objected to that. And I think that is something that's coming up in Yannick. The idea that people would want to watch this play that is a sort of love triangle of three people essentially being rude to each other. Why is that something that people would want to go to see? And I do think that filmmakers have a bit more of a duty of care to sort of lift the spirits of their audience. It's like Yannick says, people work hard. You know, they've come for some sort of release, hopefully, and then you just show them more of what's probably already happening in their personal lives. And that's not to say that you can't have this sort of art house cinema that beats you up, but I hope at least that more filmmakers could consider things like this.
I feel like you're putting us all on the spot here where theoretically any film could be stopped if it was deemed boring by one or two people who probably mistakenly wandered in there without realizing what it was all about, because even the audience is watching Les Cocos. They said like, it's kind of okay, you know. So I mean, we wouldn't want your friends, Matt, the one who didn't actually like Kurosawa, to just stand up during Iran and it's like, this is boring, turn it off. Let me do a doctor play instead. But I think we should continue because there's a lot of films to talk about here today, and the film he did just before Yannick was a film that really tied into the social moment, even though it might be dying down a little bit, and that is Smoking Causes Coughing, his superhero movie. And this is a film that really had me stoked because I was really excited. Like, the premise is hilarious. You had this early battle where they're fighting monsters and they give them cancer to the point they explode. That's pretty awesome. Like, it's just such a bizarre and ridiculous take. Like, this could have been a film that was really a breakout one for Dupieux, but then it ends up with these superheroes essentially going on a retreat and telling each other campfire stories about completely unrelated horror stories, essentially, which was not quite what I wanted. It put it down a bit in my esteem, but it is still such a crazy, crazy film, and definitely one of those films that's good conversation starter at potential dinner party if people are so inclined. So what are your guys' impression of smoking causes coughing?
I enjoyed it a whole lot. And actually, it's less a Marvel superhero movie pastiche and more specifically a tokusatsu style movie. The Japanese superhero, they were very popular in the 70s and 80s on into the 90s. The Power Rangers, Mighty Morphin Power Rangers was an adaptation of one of them. It's very much that, the cheesy costumes and the bright colors. I don't think I've laughed harder at any other Dupieux film. This one, it was hilarious to me. I enjoyed all of it, not just the superhero segments. It definitely does take a bizarre turn when they start telling the stories. But again, that's Dupieux kind of messing with people's expectations of what they come to see. I enjoyed it tremendously. All of it. The weird helmet story that's this kind of existentialist despair meditation. I think it's one of his best, even as it is one of his least focused.
There's one of the stories that is told during the film. If that was presented as a short story on its own, would be one of my very favourite films. So I think there's a character called Agathe who finds this very strange looking helmet, this sort of like tall, sort of almost like velvety sort of helmet that looks like an old toy or something on the box, enhances thought flow and quickly purifies your mind. And essentially what happens when she puts on the helmet is that she sort of gradually comes to a realization that she doesn't really like any of her friends or her husband, and she descends into this sort of murderous place. In the end, it's quite ironic. The helmet facilitates her drowning, but I wondered if that was a bit of Dupieux's sort of worldview, that actually if you examine reality sort of critically, it's an incredibly depressing thing. So the problems that people have in their lives is that they think too much and they should actually do a lot more experiencing. So I just find that incredibly poignant, and I would actually have that segment of the movie as a favourite. And it's, very stark that he's saying, this isn't a helmet that makes you depressed. This is a helmet that enhances your thinking and purifies your mind, which is quite scary, really. I was fine with the rest of the movie. That particular segment is something that's, to me, is a standout in my film watching history.
Just reinforcing exactly what Matt and Ben has said, the helmet wearing part of Smoking Causes Coughing is definitely the strongest part of the film, and likewise, I would have loved that as a 60 or 70 minute Dupieux film of itself. The rest of the film, look, it is interesting. There are interesting bits and pieces. There's a guy who gets stuck in a machine and is incredibly calm about it, and some of the things fighting off monsters were interesting, but the helmet part of it was the best part for me. And I guess just on reflection, when I do think about Smoking Causes Coughing, I think a lot of the sillier parts of it, where they're fighting the monsters, and you've got these gigantic salivating rat as their commander. And I keep thinking, oh, it's a bit of a silly film, but no, the helmet part of it was definitely a standout part. But yeah, overall, it's a bit silly for me, and I guess that's probably why I prefer his other film from 2022. And I don't know if that's a good segue or not, but Chris will tell me shortly.
No, it's a good segue, and like all of you really talked about how disjointed it is, and a little bit to a detriment, but then you can't really expect Dupieux not to be disjointed. I guess Yannick is one of those few exceptions where it tells like one clean story from start to finish. Pretty much every other film he's made trails off in one way or another or spins something around. And the most obvious example of that is the other film he did 2022, Incredible But True, which essentially has two stories side by side. They're tied together by the fact that the four protagonists are friends. But essentially, you have one couple, they move into a place where they find a time travel door. They can essentially travel back in time and get younger. Like you just go through this thing and you show up and you get younger. But the insides are rotten and starting to worry about, could this have the same effect for us? And the other one is just about Benny Magimer getting a electronic penis. So those stories side by side playing out over about 74 minutes. What was your thoughts about that one, Saul?
For me, Incredible But True is definitely one of Dupier's stronger films. For me, it's in the top half of his filmography. I actually promoted it last year for the ICM Forum Film Festival that we do on icmforum.com. And if I'm not mistaken, it actually won its subcategory. So I'm very pleased about that. For me, it's a great film because it does what Dupieux does throughout a lot of his films, which is have 2 or 3 stories in there. But he has those 2 separate stories and he just links them so well because both of them about people who don't want to age. So we've got the boss with the electronic penis who wants to be younger and perform in bed like a younger man. You've got the wife who's obsessed with going through this portal to get younger and younger and younger. And then you've got the main guy who just wants to age gracefully, and yet everybody else around him just refuses to age gracefully. So I just thought it was a really great way of tying those 2 really cool ideas together. And for me, it worked incredibly well. I guess more than something like Smoking Causes Coughing, where it just seemed to be suddenly delve into these campfire stories with Incredibly But True. It just worked incredibly well for me.
That's a pretty good summary of the movie. I sort of associate myself with all that, and I think it hangs well. Initially, when I was watching it, I found it quite horrifying just because of how shallow the characters were. Particularly, the boss is monumentally shallow, and I kind of have a fear of that. The movie becomes almost a celebration of shallowness. He starts playing all this wonderful music over it. So he's taken this very old classical music, he's turned it into synth music. I don't know if he's done it himself. Chris mentioned he's got this other day job of being Monsieur Oizo, but the music's incredibly exuberant. And I think in the end, the husband guy, like you say, who just wants to age gracefully, he just sits back and accepts the fact that his boss and his wife, they've just gone crazy. And I think I kind of entered this sort of peaceful place where I was just okay with the fact that they were doing what they were doing. They weren't going to work out pitfalls of what they were doing. Just let them get on with it. It's a film that I'm fond of.
Like Yannick, Matt, you talked about how Yannick has a lot of social commentary aspects to it. I think this one definitely speaks to materialism and the upper middle class. And I think by the end of it, it seems like Dupieux takes an almost anarchic approach to it, or really more nihilistic, in that who cares? Just whatever. If you want to buy an electric penis, just do it. It doesn't matter. At the end of the day, we all die, so you can age gracefully, or you can go to extreme lengths to try to prolong your beauty, but at the end of the day, it doesn't matter. I do think, at least for me, the 2 halves of the film didn't quite tie together as completely as maybe Saul talked about. I do think it's fully within character of Dupieux to have these kind of disjointed segments. The electric penis section really just kind of hung there. I couldn't resist. But I understand thematically how it fits in, but just the way that the film flowed, it's almost like 2 variations on a theme that just slowly elaborated, but ultimately didn't really end up anywhere. But I think that was the intent of it.
I mean, not really ending up anywhere is what usually happens with Dupieux as well. Fully agree with you, actually, on the 2 parts. I think that the time travel portion of the film was more interesting than the electronic penis portion. I think the electronic penis portion just was too silly to me. Like it's fine, it's there, but this is not, one of my favorite Dupieux, even though like one half of it was pretty interesting. And I really, really enjoyed Alain Clavé in the lead. Like the way he sort of keeps saying, he's busy at work, etc. But when you go to his computer, he's just playing video games and he's this like 50, 60-year-old guy. I thought that was pretty fun as well. Like there's all these little tidbits throughout the film. There's definitely a lot of laughs as well. So another fun little odd outing. But talking about silly, I'm not sure if this is going to be the silliest Dupieux, but it is certainly the one with the silliest poster cover. It's pink title, unicorn, bicycle. I'm talking, of course, of Mandibules, about two stoners who train a fly to commit heists. It's just about this guy who's essentially homeless, living on the beach, his equally elusive friend stumbling upon a huge fly and getting the crazy idea of, hey, we can train it to steal stuff. They kind of go on a road trip to try to find places to stay while they train it. They try to hide it. And it's just all out deadpan silliness. And honestly, this is one of my favorite Dupieux. It's just so bright. The cinematography is a little bit like, it's almost this pastel notion about it as well. It has that perfect hangout feel. And I think it's honestly one of his most accessible in so many ways. What do you guys think about this little fly or big fly?
I'm interested to know what you mean about accessible, Chris. I didn't find it accessible at all, so I don't know if you have any clarificatory comments around that.
Oh, sure. I mean, I think it's essentially a stoner comedy about two guys doing something utterly bizarre and getting into awkward situations. Like it's surreal-ish. Obviously, like it has an insane subject line, but it's not one of those, like it's not trapped within dreams. It's not looping all over and over again. It's like it actually tells the story from start to finish, a bit like Yannick, and it just has a concept. It just kind of hangs there. I think this is one of those films that I think you genuinely just, maybe especially in France, you can probably just put this on with regular people and they might get a fun ride out of it, as opposed.
I think you're right that it could be like a party film. I mean, I was thinking about another stoner movie that I watched recently. It's a Greg Araki movie. I don't know if anyone's seen it. It's called Smiley Face. That movie is so crazy that it makes you feel like you're stoned by the things that could have happened. Whereas this thing where you discover this bug in the boot of a car that is way too big to actually be a bug, and no one even begins to try to explain that. No part of this movie felt like I was enjoying myself. I think there's two distinct parts of it. When they sort of gate crash this party, essentially. For me, this genuinely did feel like the part of Dupieux who is just making scenarios up whilst he's high, or talking to a bunch of kids, or the Daaaaálí, this the surreal art generator.
That's very true, actually. I mean, at this point, he might be asking ChatGPT as well. Who knows? I mean, probably not when he was coming up with Mandibules' scenario, because that was just before it was launched. But today, maybe he'll just do that too. But yes, it's very true. He might just be coming up with ideas while high.
Mandibules reminded me a lot of Wrong Cops and Steak, where it is a hangout movie. The Fly is almost superfluous. They barely even comment on it. It really doesn't have much of an effect on the overarching plot, whatever there may be of it. It's really just these guys just kind of doing stuff. If you look at the IMDb plot, it makes it sound like it's something that it just isn't at all. It's not really about them training a fly to rob banks or whatever. That's kind of barely touched on for a large part of the movie. It's just kind of a hangout. It reminds me a lot of the kind of things you would see on Adult Swim, maybe, or Super Troopers,
or like MTV back in the 2000s.
Something Seth Rogen might do. I'm just gonna smoke a lot of weed and I'm gonna write around these two guys just kind of wandering around doing stuff. And it is a pleasant hangout movie, but it honestly is not one of my favorite Dupieux. It lacks a certain cleverness that some of his best movies have.
Perfectly fair. I think I agree there too. Like, it's nowhere near as, like, it doesn't have the surreal touches, it doesn't have the meta touches. It's really just, yeah, like you said, similar to steak and rom cops in so many ways.
I probably agree with everybody else's assessment that this isn't one of Dupier's stronger films. I do think it's more accessible than usual, just from what Chris has said. It's basically a stoner comedy. It's a hangout comedy. Hangout comedies are like the number one most popular thing out there at the moment. So I can understand why it would probably be more accessible. The giant fly, yeah, look, I know Ben said that the film could do without it, but for me, I guess I saw the film as being about pet ownership and about these two guys who've never owned a pet before and have no idea how to take care of an animal and just think they can train it, and it's just totally above their head. So for me, I thought there was some slight satire going on there, but it is sort of slight because a lot of it is about the situation, especially that part of the gate crash and they're mistaken for these two long lost friends and they just play along with it. The humor for me is a bit up and down. I didn't like the fact that there's a brain damaged character, and the fact that she's brain damaged is played for laughs. I thought that was quite mean spirited. But yeah, look, in general, it's a quirky film. I like Dupieux when he's quirky, so I enjoyed it, but I wouldn't say it's one of his top tier efforts.
What I meant about the fly is superfluous, I meant you could have replaced the fly with any kind of animal, and it would have played out almost exactly the same. Aside from like a scene or two, it could have just been a big ugly dog, and they would have had the same kind of reactions to it.
Yeah, but a huge fly is more bizarre. Both the bizarreness that a huge fly might be, one of his more bizarre oddities has to be Deerskin from 2019, where he actually got George then, like one of France's biggest stars, to play a man who buys a deerskin jacket, starts talking to that jacket, and starts realizing that, hey, this jacket wants to be the only jacket in the world. But at the same time, just loving deerskin and wanting more and more deerskin for himself. Oh, and at the same time, filming himself starting to kill people, and at the same time tricking a editor to think that the footage he's shooting of himself killing people is actually a horror movie he's making and that he's a film director. It spins in so many loops. You have Adel Hanel as well, another big French star, as his editor, actually editing through this footage. It's definitely plays in all of these filmmaking attributes that a lot of Dupieux's films have incorporated in them, and actually, except for Daaaaálí, we haven't really touched on that yet. So that super meta style, it's something that's going to be fun to just actually dive into here. Oh, and I also really just love the tagline, "Killer Style." What do you guys think about Deerskin?
I actually like Deerskin quite a bit. It almost feels like, if you go all the way back to Dupieux's first film, Nonfilm, Deerskin almost feels like he took the themes he liked from Nonfilm and applied it to a more cohesive narrative. There's a lot of that same meta commentary there, and filming what you think you're filming, but it isn't what you're filming. By the way, I'm not totally convinced that the editor was tricked. I think she may have known what was happening and leaned into it. That partially explains her avidness for his work.
Deerskin is a film that we've actually discussed already in our best of 2019 podcast. So if anybody who's interested in hearing more about our thoughts on it, you're welcome to go and give that podcast a listen or a re-listen. Since doing the 2019 podcast, I've actually watched the film a second time. And I guess for me, I was hoping to love it even more the second time, and I didn't. I thought it was a great, but not absolutely amazing film. The meta stuff is really interesting, and I guess the central idea is interesting that he keeps buying all these deerskin products, with the question being how much deerskin products can you buy until you become a deer yourself, which I guess is kind of interesting with the way that people are looking at animal rights these days to a point where actually it is too much and it is just excessive. So yeah, look, it was all quite interesting, but I guess first and foremost, I really just like Deerskin as a comedy. It is incredibly funny. A lot of things that happen, a lot of the absurd situations. It gets all these people to put the deerskin coats into the trunk of his car, get them to say on camera that they're never going to wear deerskin again. And then he says, "Oh, I've got it on film. You're screwed," and takes off with all the deerskin products. So all that's quite funny. I guess I was just hoping for a bit more the second time, whereas the second time round, I guess I pretty much liked it equally as the first time round.
I'm just going to make a quick comment. I haven't watched the Deerskin movie, but I am heavily into animal rights, as everyone on the forum will sort of know and have been annoyed about from time to time. But I think as someone who you know is very much a believer in not using animal products, there are things that are strange about humans. For example, if you think about the serial killer Ed Gein, you know, he walked around wearing clothes made of people's skin, an absolutely horrendous thing, and everyone sort of recognizes that as horrendous. But for some reason, we're able to compartmentalize our minds and not see that as horrendous anymore, even though we have a very easy ability to make clothes from natural fibers. Just very briefly mention as well, Chris was talking about the ability for Dupieux to get stars to act in his films. His most recent film, which hasn't been released outside of Cannes yet, as far as I know, he had actually managed to get Léa Seydoux to star in that film, which, I mean, I know she does take risks, but people are on board to have a bit of fun with Quentin.
Definitely, and let's see who we can get next too. I mean, it seems like pretty much everyone's lining up to work with him now, which is quite a change from when he was working in Hollywood. Was getting semi-big names, like he got Bill Hader in one, but yeah, it's incredible to just see how many big stars he keeps getting into his films. And I mean, his next one also got a pretty big name, Barry Purwood, who's quite well known from a large amount of Belgian and French comedies and others as a hard-ass cop questioning a suspect. And this is one of his most meta film, where, you know, suddenly we start realizing that what we're watching is actually part of a play to, like, the suspect's surprise. And it goes into crazier and weirder and more bizarre places. I mean, this is another one of those films that really just has realism or bizarreness for the sake of it. It's definitely one of those things that you guys talked about earlier could fit well in on Adult Swim, for instance. It's just bizarre, crazy, silly, eye-gouging jokes, etc. And it's also another one of his shorter ones at just 73 minutes. But what do you guys think about Keep an Eye Out?
This is one of my favorite Dupieux movies. It's both incredibly absurdist and surreal, but also strangely focused. He doesn't spin off into multiple subplots. Even by the end, when it's going incredibly meta and really bizarre, it's still ostensibly the same film. It isn't like Incredible But True, where it's two completely disparate narratives, or Smoking Causes Coughing, where they start nesting these totally unrelated short films. And it's almost like the ideal Dupieux film. It embodies every aspect of what he does really well into one more cohesive whole.
I like Keep an Eye Out quite a lot also. For me, it's probably his third best after Daaaaálí and Rubber. For me, what I really like about the film is it's not just that you've got those meta or surreal elements to it, but it's actually extremely Kafkaesque. You've got this guy who's being interrogated from a cop who thinks he's guilty of murder, and then when the cop goes out, another cop is watching him. The other cop suddenly dies, and it's all about trying to cover it up and try to also convince that cop that he's not guilty of murder. Everything just keeps escalating in a way that I think Kafkaesque is the only way I can use to describe it. And I just love Kafkaesque films. So for me, this was totally up my alleyway.
Yeah, I quite enjoy Keep an Eye Out. I just thought it was a little bit too silly, which is ironic since I like Mandibules, but it still hit on all of the things you'd expect from Dupieux, and if you like Dupieux, I mean, this pretty much has it all. But the feature film he made before Keep an Eye Out is actually one of my favorites, and it is the last one he did in the US, though it's a co-French film. Like, he did a few films in the US which were essentially all English language. This one is, I think, primarily French, or 50-50, because the cast is mixed. There's a bunch of French people living in the US, including a super producer and a filmmaker who has an idea for a horror film where TVs blow people's minds, literally. They just scramble their brains until blood starts gushing out. And the producer says, wow, I love this. But get me to fund it, you have to find the perfect dream. And you have this guy running around with a recorder trying to just find that scream. He records it over and over and over again. And while this is happening, he starts dreaming, and in his dreams, he starts making contact with the real world. He starts seeing that, oh wow, the film I made is actually out already, but he tries to stop the showing of his own film, saying, no, it's not done yet. I'm gonna fix this. These sound effects are bad. And at the same time, too, John Heder is like this guy who is struggling with scratches of the show that the filmmaker is actually working on as a cameraman. And he starts to think that, hey, maybe we could be the same person. It's utterly wild. You also have Eric Warham, who was in Wrong Cops, as this guy who's either in dreams or in reality just having bizarre experiences as well. And this all ties into also a movie where that John Glover is making and showing, and somehow things that's happening in our movie is happening inside his movie as well. It's a proper circular mess that would make Daaaaálí blush a little bit. It's a lot of the same ideas, a lot of the same circularness, a lot of the same dreams within dreams, but with the slight change that is also hyper meta. And in fact, it has a similar ending where the film ends with the end and then it goes out of the TV screen. So there's definitely a connection here. Fans of Daaaaálí should definitely check out Reality. But I'd love to hear, like, were you guys as fascinated as me with Reality, or am I the outlier here?
I know Matt hasn't seen this one yet. I can't speak for Ben, but to me, you are the outlier, Chris. I mean, I like all of Dupieux's films from Rubber onwards. To me, that, like I've said before, they're all good or great. For me, I guess Reality is one of the less memorable ones, partly because it's quite long for him. So it actually takes a very long time for all the different plot threads to start intersecting. When they do start intersecting, it does get incredibly interesting with all the things we've got characters who are witnessing other people's dreams and so on. But it does take quite a while to get to that point, and there are a few parts, and they've definitely stood out in my mind. You've got this young girl who finds a VHS tape in a belly of a pig and has no VCR to play it on. So lots of interesting bits and pieces, but I guess to me it hasn't stacked up in my mind as quite as cohesive a narrative, maybe just because it's so long, relatively long for Dupieux, that it's so long and just takes a while to build it up. But it is one that I'm interested in rewatching sometime down the track.
I think, like Saul, I feel similar. So this was the second Dupieux film I watched, I believe, after Rubber. So it's been quite a while since I've seen it. But from what I remember, it did seem a little unfocused even for him. And to Saul's point, it could be because it was longer. Felt like he needed to kind of have more threads going on, fill it out to proper movie length. Kind of saw that with all of his American films. They felt a little padded, but I did remember enjoying it, and it is one that I would like to rewatch sometime. But just based on my memory as of now, it's not one of my favorites.
Yeah, I mean, I can see that, and I think it's pretty fun to say that, you know, hey, this 95-minute film, with, of course, which include, of course, the end titles and stuff too, it's too padded, it's too long, but this is actually Quentin Dupieux's longest film, and as we're recording right now, we're actually for longer than the majority of his films, and we're going to catch up to reality soon. So that's an interesting tidbit. I saw reality just this week for the first time. For some reason, I had waited to see it. I had a blast watching it. I thought that it kind of improved on, because I also saw Wrong and Wrong Cops this week, but I thought it was a big step up from them. This is actually his second highest rated according to IMDb. So there are some other people who think like me, at least. But let's jump over to Wrong Cops, which is another like just crazy film. It's not one of his American films. This one is all American, and it stars Marilyn Manson. Even has a cameo from Eric Roberts. You have also some smaller parts by, Rye, etc. Oh, and Eric Warheim is back. It's essentially about a bunch of corrupt, sleazy, crazy cops. One of them sells weed inside of rats. Another one wants to become a music star. Another one wants to blackmail a colleague so she can get plastic surgery. A fourth one essentially goes around with a gun trying to force women to show them their breasts. And Marilyn Manson plays I don't even know what we want to call him, a music enthusiast.
Supposed to be a teenager.
Yeah, that he looks like it.
The way he's dressed and acts.
Yes, it's such he's pretty awesome in this film. Actually, the whole film is so deadpan, but his look in this film is one of the most memorable. Oh, and Mark Burnham is kind of like the lead. The acting is so deadpan, it's so off that it's easy to kind of brush it off a bit too. But that deadpanness, it works. It's what it did in the US. It's all awkward acting, but it's crazy enough to fit. It's not a big favorite for me, but I definitely had several laughs along the way. Did you guys enjoy it?
I liked it in general. Interestingly, Wrong Cops has by far the lowest Metacritic score of any of his films. It's got like a 25 or something, which is abysmal. I can kind of see why. I think critics, they went into it thinking it was going to be a Super Troopers type movie. Just kind of a silly comedy, and it's a Dupieux film through and through. It is definitely his film. It's incredibly weird, very absurdist, very dry absurdism, which I think just for American audiences, they didn't get it. I think if you go into it thinking it's going to be Super Troopers, you will be sorely disappointed. By the way, I didn't like Super Troopers that much. I don't get the cult around it. I didn't think it was that funny. I probably like Wrong Cops more. Having said all that, I do think it is definitely not one of his better movies. It's way too meandering. It's got several different plot threads going on to varying degrees of success. I will say the soundtrack is great. It's one of his few movies where he actually applies his Mr. Oizo music, which to me seems weird. You built your whole career out of being a musician and then you barely put your music in any of your movies. But it works really well in the context of Wrong Cops.
And it's so funny too, because he's essentially Eric Udor, who we worked with before as well in Steak and in Wrong. He's the guy who's creating the pure music, and every time that he shows music, all the people he shows it to, it's like, this sucks! This is the worst music we've ever heard! This is ridiculous! He loves to denigrate his own music a bit too. Oh, I forgot to mention the most absurd thing is that Officer Duke, our lead, he shoots a guy and then drives around with him in his trunk, realizes he's alive, and that the music pumps life back into him. Essentially, he's kind of like sitting there with blood coming out of him, but every time the music is pumped up, he starts moving and being more alive again, which is probably one of the more awkward parts of the film as well. Yeah, this is one of those films. Again, it feels a bit like he just got stoned and thought about it. I think this is one of those films too that it could probably be a big hit with stoners. I think if you put this in adult film, for instance, I think you would get some fan base for it. Mm-hmm. The big detriment of this was probably the people, like you said, that did think it was going to be Super Troopers. It's definitely kind of a more, not mainstream element to it, but this is not hyper meta. There's nothing meta really in this film. It's just crazy, bizarre, ridiculous. Definitely, it's things in here to be accessible to viewers, even though it is still super bizarre.
I could see it picking up a cult audience if it were shown on TV at 2 a.m, that kind of thing. Whether you're stoned or not, just you're sleep deprived and your head's fuzzy, and then this weird movie happens in front of you. And, you know, I could see it being successful in that kind of setting. I think that's kind of how it was intended to be watched.
I wouldn't be surprised. And, I mean, this film goes a bit hand in hand too with Wrong. I mean, they share half the name. A lot of the same cast is in it as well, like Steve Little, Eric Udor, Art Mirren, like a lot of these same actors. Mark Burnham as well is in it, and he plays a cop. And actually, Jack Plotnick, who plays the lead in Wrong, has like a cameo walking his dog from Wrong in Wrong Cops. So maybe they're in the same universe. Who the hell knows? But Wrong is not one of those films that's just bizarre. It's not really meta. It's more just weird. And again, it's several different plot threads happening at the same time, but mainly focused on Jack Plotnick losing his dog, trying to find it, realizing it like company run by William Fletcher has stolen it, so he would love the dog more. Also trying to get into reading Fletcher's book and trying to do mind control with the dog at the same time that Eric Udor impersonates the other character and starts a relationship with a woman who suddenly gets pregnant, and a pregnancy that's hyper fast. So you have all of these things spinning in circles. It's weird, it's bizarre. I thought the deadpan, again, it's both the detriment and good. Like there's lots of laughs here, but it's more, again, just it doesn't hit as well as his French films, I think, or reality. It's a bit more off. It's a bit more awkward. Definitely one of those that could have been put on adult film kind of thing. It's not one of my favorites. It's one of his weakest in my mind, but there's still so many fun moments throughout the film as well.
It's a little more focused than Wrong Cops, but only relatively. It's still very scattered. It also has a lot of surrealism just for the sake of surrealism, you know, raining indoors and things like that. There's a lot of just absurdist things that happen for no particular reason. For some reason, the movie just doesn't click with me as well as a lot of his do. I can't really pinpoint why. It just feels a little scattered and meandering, even for him. Something about it just kept me from really enjoying it as much as I do some of his others. I still thought it was entertaining, and it did have its funny moments.
I completely agree there. So why don't we just jump on to his probably most known and viewed film, Rubber. This is a proper conversation piece. Anyone who's into horror, anyone who's into weird stuff, hey, you have a car tire blowing up people with its mind powers. You had killer cars, here's a tire. That's such a good pitch, and then not so obvious given Wrong and Wrong Cops. He instills so many meta elements. Not really funny games, but he incorporates just the joy of watching people getting murdered, essentially, as people are following around this curated tour to essentially watch the tire kill people. Could maybe add some social commentary there. Who knows? It's, once again, hyper deadpan, but again, it just plays on trashy B-movie horror film tropes with like this meta that pushes it up and makes it a completely different beast. I didn't manage to rewatch it for this episode because I focused on finishing up his filmography, but wow, like, I still have so many flashes from this film that it's so many things about this film that's memorable and stands out. And it's definitely one of my favorites.
Rubber was actually the first Dupieux movie that I watched, and I probably watched it because of this forum. I think we had done a poll of best movies of the 2010s. It was something like that, and it come high up on that poll. But I thought, well, it looks absolutely terrible, you know, a movie about a sort of tyre that goes around killing people. But seeing as everyone seems to have liked it, I'm going to go watch this movie. But to me, it never stopped being as terrible as it sounded. There's this modern thing where as soon as you introduce a meta element, that's meant to sort of erase all sins, you know, because you know what you're doing. You can't be criticized for it, whereas it did actually seem very unpleasant. There is this audience within the movie, and that audience within that movie starts to get killed off. And you almost feel like, what is it going to take to get people to walk out the cinema or to turn the off button if it's not seeing sort of proxies of themselves killed on the screen. So this is a film that I absolutely hate, and I think it got me off to a bad start with Dupieux because he's a very prolific filmmaker, and it was definitely a bad first impression for me, and reminded me of a movie that I'm definitely not recommending to anybody, but maybe people are interested in being recommended by anti-recommendations, is a movie called The Return of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the fourth installment in that franchise, which is also a strong comedy elements and strong meta elements. There's a part in that movie where one of the main family members is called Vilma, and at one point this guy just turns up, I think it was in a limo, this guy who's meant to come off as like the devil, and he spends quite a long time sort of apologizing to the victims that, you know, Vilma is no good at his job. He should have managed to terrify them more or whatever. And you kind of sat there watching it and you think, well, he has just very well criticized this entire movie. It has been very poor grand guignol. And again, why am I watching it? You know, and it does this sort of meta comment manage to make the movie good. And I wondered if Pierre had seen it, but this sort of mixture of sadism and meta commentary, definitely not for me.
Well, I did not expect that reaction. It's a good thing that kind of sadism meta-comedy is for me then. What did you think, Sal?
Anybody who knows me knows that I love meta cinema. I'm the person who has Scream in their all-time top 4. So for me, I did think it was a great film the first time round. What really bugged me the first time round is I couldn't actually work out why they were trying to kill their audience. To me, that made no sense. But when I rewatched the film, I thought it worked a little bit better. I thought it was sort of like a philosophical conundrum. You've got the idea of whether a falling tree makes a sound if nobody's around to hear it. And it's like Dupieux is asking, does a film still exist if there's nobody around to watch it? And there's a whole lot of interesting things also about the audience within the film. You've got one of them who's talking about the fact that we never see characters in the movie go to the bathroom. And yet in this film, we actually see the audience watching the movie. They go to the bathroom, they eat, they sleep, and that actually is their undoing. So the fact that the characters who are watching the movie within the movie act like real human beings rather than movie characters is what leads to their downfall. So it still might not really give motivation to why they're being killed, but it does sort of make it more interesting that we're sort of seeing the death of the audience because the audience act like real human beings rather than movie characters, which to me is incredibly interesting. And I guess it's the reason why this one's still my second favorite Dupieux film so far.
Like most people, it was the first Dupieux film that I watched. And Chris, actually, to your point about Dupieux being brought up in dinner parties, if any of them did, it would be this one. I've had people that do not watch foreign films, do not watch niche cult films, bring Rubber up because it received such wide distribution. It was released on Blu-ray in the US by Magnolia Pictures, you know, who's distributed several of Lars von Trier's movies like Melancholia. I think it's more seen than any of his other movies. At the time when I saw it, I really enjoyed the meta element of it. It starts with the premise of, you know, something that just sounds awful, like Deathbed or, you know, one of those terrible Sci-Fi Channel original movies, like the three-headed shark attack, that kind of thing. But, you know, Dupieux really spins it off in a very different direction. I think to Matt's point, there is an active contempt for the audience there, which is actually kind of odd. Dupieux really doesn't tackle that particular topic in any of his other films to this extent. That's really more Lars von Trier's territory, maybe Michael Haneke. But I wasn't reviled by it the same way that Matt was, maybe. I found it interesting. It's one that I would definitely plan to rewatch sometime in the near future.
Yeah, I often think about like how well this will hold up when I watch it, because obviously his other American films didn't work as well with me, while I enjoy his deadpan. who knows, maybe it will go down for me. But yeah, that revulsion of the audience is one of those things that have got me to really like it, to be honest. I don't know why. To me, like that kind of hatred and anger, or whatever you want to call it, that always wins me over when used in films. So I'm the complete opposite of Matt there. But I do think it's interesting to kind of see the connection between Rubber and Yannick, because in this film, the audience can just be killed off. In Yannick, the audience deserves better, I suppose. So that's an interesting journey for him.
That's absolutely bang on, Chris. Throwing those two movies back to back would be a real thrilling experience, I think.
And we're almost back to the very beginning now, actually, because there's only 2 feature films left. And the last one is not in a proper feature. So his first big proper film was a comedy called Steak, starring Eric and Ramsey. The Eric there is Eric Udor, who has been in a few of his American films. It was Eric and Ramsey was this fairly big comedy duo in France at the time. He managed to loop those guys in, and he did essentially a bizarre, not really a buddy comedy because they kind of get split up. But it's crazy. It has all of the same things that he did in his American films, but it's not hyper meta. It's about a bullied boy who finds a machine gun. He ends up killing his bullies, and his friend takes the blame. 7 years later, that friend comes out of a mental hospital, and the other friend is now part of a group of bullies that is very like almost 50s, 60s clique with same jackets just hanging around, and they're all obsessed with plastic surgery, which I guess could tie into Incredible but True. It just kind of follows this journey of the outcast friend wanting to reintegrate with society, and that's more or less it. Weird, bizarre comedy. I thought it's one of his lightest, but it's still very much like Dupieux. You can see this and Wrong Cops, etc. back to back. It's pretty much exactly the same comedy, pretty much exactly the same craziness. It is in, I suppose, slightly more straightforward package, but it's all of the same building blocks. What did you guys think about Steak?
I would agree with that assessment. It definitely feels like Dupieux is putting down a template for one of his main themes that he returns to, this kind of meandering absurdism. You know, like I said, I saw a lot of it in Mandibules, especially, and it's fine. But I do think he hadn't quite honed his comedic sensibility at that point. It feels a little rough around the edges to me.
Yeah, I'm not a big fan of Steak either. It's the only Dupieux film that I have down as less than a 7 out of 10. Everything else that I've seen from him has been a 7 or 8. So for me, this is his weakest by far. I guess for me, it's got a couple of really cool ideas there. The random finding of the machine gun was quite interesting, but I guess it doesn't really do a lot of it. A lot of it's a bit of a hangout comedy, sort of what Ben said. It's a bit like Mandibules, but it's just weird rather than funny. They're playing a weird maths game. He wants to be part of the cool kids. I actually had no idea how old the characters were. I couldn't work that out. So they're teenagers, but then he goes to jail and comes out, and his friend's still acting like a teenager, trying to impress the cool kids and get in with the crowd. Yeah, for me, I guess it was more weird than funny. Whereas for most of his subsequent films, they're equally weird and funny.
Yeah, I think I can subscribe to that. It just wasn't as funny as the rest, and I also agree it's a bit rough around the edges, and it's more around just putting down a stake, like Ben said. And that brings us to Dupieux's very, very first effort, 5 years earlier, with Nonfilm. This is so low budget that it essentially feels like one of those shot on it probably was shot on VHS, honestly. Like, if you guys remember that face that Takashi Miike had in like the mid-90s, like he kind of has that aesthetic but even more rough. But shockingly, at least in my mind, like all of the building blocks of Dupieux were here. And it's almost closer to what he would make from reality and onwards than the films he would make next. Because the film is essentially about these people trying to make a film. An actor wakes up in his car, he walks into the shoot, he becomes part of the film. You see things from different angles, certain things get redone. And at one point, in probably the best scene in the film, the main character / director gets a machine gun. They put real bullets in for effect. This is not really a spoiler because it's in the IMDb synopsis. It happens fairly early. He just accidentally shoots all of the technical crew. He just blasts them away. It's such a bizarre scene. And then after that, they start to just continue making the film, but without the movie camera. What are they doing? No one questions that at all. And they just keep acting, and this director / lead actor keeps pushing everyone away, and it's just utterly meta. It's on Vimeo for free, posted by Dupieux himself, where he in the description says it's unwatchable. I didn't actually think so. Like, I enjoyed it more than Steak, honestly. I thought there was a lot of clever ideas. You could get a lot of sense of who he is, who he's going to become. And I thought that the lo-fi aesthetics honestly worked a lot of the time. And there's some, like, the ending too, like, it's such a meta, kind of like hilarious. I'm not going to spoil it for those people who go to Vimeo and seek it out after this, but it's just such a Dupieux ending. I think Ben is the only other person who's seen this. So I just love to hear what your thoughts were about Nonfilm.
In general, I pretty much agree with you. It's interesting to see how Dupieux, this early, knows what he wants to do. All the building blocks of what he would build on are here. I will say I didn't absolutely love it. There are some slow sections. It's not as actively funny outside of a couple of scenes you've mentioned. It was an interesting watch. I would definitely recommend it for fans of Dupieux to see how even this early he already has a pretty firm grasp of what he wants to do in film. Chris, did you see Nonfilm 2?
No, I didn't get around to it. That's like 13 minutes, right? So I focused on the feature. Did you?
It's actually only 14 minutes. I won't get into too much detail, but I will say it's even more of a variation on a theme. It gets even more meta than Nonfilm. And actually, I mentioned how Nonfilm reminded me of Deerskin. There are elements of it there with the movie that he's making in that. And I think Nonfilm 2 is even more so. But it's definitely worth checking out if you like Dupieux. All of his short films are interesting. I know we weren't planning to cover them in any detail, but I will say for fans out there, I would suggest checking out his Flat Eric music video that he did under Mr. Oizo, and then following up with his Being Flat short film, which is kind of a sequel to that video, which is also entertaining, and has Steve Little in it.
Just watched the both of those just like 10-15 minutes before the episode started because they are that short. It's like 7 and 3 minutes, I think. And but pretty fun. Especially the latter one is very much in the style of Dupieux. So good fit. And I completely agree with you too. Like Nonfilm and Deerskin fit perfectly together. They're so close, so similar in trajectory. I think Nonfilm and reality too, really close. Even Daaaaálí put Nonfilm and Daaaaálí together, and you still have this sense of importance of the film camera, the artist who has specific visions. It all fits so well together. So we're lucky in a way that Daaaaálí was his last one properly out by the time we did this episode, though he has another one released at Cannes already, that should be out properly soon. I can't wait for that. It looks pretty fun too. I think that at this point I've gotten to the point that I'm seeking out pretty much every new Dupieux. But I'm really happy we did this episode because it got me to check out his older ones, and I found Reality, which I thought was great. Like I'm not as big a fan as Saul. I only have a few that I really, really like, and then the others are, from that's really good, like Daaaaálí to good enough. But he's always interesting, and he always has these little things that makes me laugh. So definitely one of those directors. It's always fun to explore.
If I had a plea to anyone listening to the podcast, it's to go and see his films in the cinema. There are these films where, sometimes you might miss a joke. The whole rest of the audience are laughing, then you suddenly realise, oh, that's happening. But it's just an amazing vibe. Everyone's enjoying themselves. You see a lot of his films on IMDb and Letterboxd don't have great ratings, but the people that are seeing them in the cinemas definitely seem to be having a really good time.
Yeah, I would love to see his movies in a theater. Unfortunately, I live in Middle America where we just don't get interesting movies playing in theaters for the most part, which is unfortunate.
Yeah, same for me in Malta, I'm afraid. Not happening.
Same for me in Perth. I'd like to definitely see a lot of his films theatrically because a lot of them are comedies, and I love watching comedies with an audience. But Deerskin, and I guess because it was starring the Oscar-winning actor from The Artist, was the only film, I think, since I've been going to the movies, is his only film that's actually been screened theatrically over here. I think a lot of his other films actually haven't had proper releases either, other than through movies, so they haven't actually been even available on DVD, so he's still a little bit of an out there figure, but I'm hoping that one day he'll become a little bit more widely appreciated, and we actually might see theatrical screenings of his films over here.
Yeah, maybe he just needs to team up with Dusha again. Or maybe Seduk can actually push him to the same level, though. Probably doesn't have the exact same pool in Middle America and Australia. But you never know. I mean, she's been in... I mean, she was a Bond girl in 2 films. But I think we come to our meandering end. I mean, we're already well above the time limit of any Quentin Dupieux film. The finished episode will be shorter, but we're ticking in on the 2-hour mark here in the recording booth. So, wow, well done, everyone. I don't think we can end this episode in a Dupieux way, unless we just keep asking if the tape is rolling or leave some blank space. I will not do that, just because I respect you, dear audience, too much. With that, and with our glorious podcast that didn't meander as much as possibly should, given the topic, thank you so much for listening, and join us again soon.
You have been listening to Talking Images, the official podcast of icmforum.com.